We were pushed through the front door, and once we entered, we felt like we were in hell itself. There were corpses everywhere and watchtowers with guards pointing their machine guns at us. Meanwhile, gray ash fell from the sky from the bodies burned in the ovens. There were dogs barking menacingly, and the air was filled with the noise of loudspeakers shouting orders at us. There were always SS men on the lookout, in their spotless uniforms and well-holstered pistols. We had never been so scared before. With these words, Mindu Hornick, a camp survivor, recalls her first moments in the Auschwitz concentration camp. This site operated between May 1940 and January 1945, and it was here that Nazism committed its most aberrational crimes. Auschwitz prisoners were strictly watched by the SS, an organization that served as the camp's authority. Discipline was maintained with an iron hand, and any infraction, no matter how minor, was severely punished. The most frequent crimes consisted of acquiring more food than the one granted in the small daily ration, escaping from forced labor, or working with reluctance. It was also not allowed to smoke or go to the bathroom without permission, although urinating on oneself was also a crime. Inmates were required to wear their black and white uniform at all times, and those who tried to replace it with other clothing were punished. Life in Auschwitz was hell, but the prisoners had to go through it without complaint, and the regulations stated that suicide attempts were strictly prohibited. Those who tried and failed to take their own life would have to face the fury of Nazi officers. The administration of punishment was somewhat arbitrary, and it was up to the Auschwitz guards to decide the fate of offenders. The lightest penalties consisted of not being allowed to write letters or receive mail from their loved ones. This brought psychological consequences, but the physical integrity of a person was not threatened. From here, the intensity of the punishments increased. Sometimes prisoners were forced to squat with their arms outstretched and holding a heavy object in their hands. They had to stay like this for hours, knowing that if they didn't make it, they would suffer a beating. Sometimes, for the indiscipline of a single person, all his companions in the barracks were punished. The entire group had to stand in the courtyard, regardless of whether it was unbearably hot or bitterly cold. Sometimes they could spend a whole day like this, without eating or drinking, until most of them fainted and lay on the ground. Later, once they regained consciousness, those who had not resisted had to run 100 meters to show the guards that they still had the capacity to work. If they were unable to do so, they were sent to die in the gas chambers. One of the most common and fearsome punishments at Auschwitz was flogging. The inmate was taken to the central courtyard, where his feet were immobilized inside a wooden box, his arms were extended, and his stomach was made to rest on a table. Next, a guard would approach with a whip or a stick, and the ordeal would begin. The blows tore the offender's body, shreds of skin dangling from his back, and a pool of blood formed around him. Meanwhile, the other inmates were forced to witness the act to instill terror in their minds and drive away any idea of rebellion. The prisoner had to hold back his cries of pain and count the number of lashes out loud. If he was wrong, the lashes would start from 0, only stopping when he reached 25. One of the cruelest punishments took place in Pavilion 11, the place where the rebels, saboteurs, and captured fugitives ended up. There, the prisoners were locked in cells whose windows were partially covered with bricks. In the dim light, the only thing they had at their disposal was a wooden bed, so uncomfortable that after sleeping on it they woke up with stiff muscles. However, in this dungeon there were even more terrible cells, like the famous dark cages, which had no windows. There were only sheets of metal with small holes through which air circulated and thin rays of light filtered through. The Nazis sent those sentenced to die of starvation here, so that the prisoner was plunged into absolute darkness for days. He received no food, although sometimes they gave him water to delay death and prolong his suffering, as he slowly lost his sanity and entered a state of delirium. Finally, the lack of food weakened him to the point where he lost his life. By the time the guards removed him from the cage, the inmate was little more than a pile of bones. Starting in 1942, the Nazis implemented a new type of cells, characterized by being extremely small spaces, barely 1 square meter. In this claustrophobic room, up to 4 people were admitted at the same time, who had to remain standing because they could not lie down. The only ventilation available was a small hole 2 inches in diameter. At night, the most unruly prisoners were forced to stay there, to ensure that they could not rest properly. It should be remembered that arbitrariness reigned in Auschwitz, so an inmate did not always know the reasons for which he was punished. Sometimes the guards were in a bad mood or bored and decided to entertain themselves with the suffering of others. The beatings were a daily occurrence, and at times the assaults escalated to the point where the prisoner's head was thrown into an oven. They wouldn't let him out until the heat burned all his skin and cooked his eyes. On the other hand, the SS liked to organize dances of death, that is, taking a Jewish prisoner into a ring, where 3 guards who knew how to box would beat him to death. In the testimonies of the survivors, it is clear that one of the most feared punishments was that of the post. This penalty was administered in the courtyard outside Pavilion 11, where the offender's hands were tied behind his back and then he was hung from a crossbar so that his feet did not touch the ground. The victim was left for hours in this position, often losing consciousness. The direct consequence of this punishment was that his shoulder tendons were torn, making his arms useless. Since he could no longer serve in forced labor, he was usually sentenced to death and killed by firing squad or in the gas chambers. As we see, Auschwitz was the climax of the Third Reich's madness, and the horror did not cease until it was liberated by the Allies in early 1945. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what do you think was the most savage punishment in Auschwitz? During World War II, in Poland, one of the bloodiest extermination camps in the entire Third Reich operated, Treblinka. As part of the plan designed by the Nazis, it is estimated that some 900,000 Jews were murdered in the gas chambers in this place. The establishment functioned like a perfect killing machine, where thousands of people perished every day, and the prisoners entered there with the only certainty that they would not come out alive. However, in 1943, a group of inmates decided to risk everything to escape from that hell. They knew their chances of success were slim, but they were willing to try anyway. It was better to die fighting than end their days suffocated with lethal gas. The day of the uprising was set for August 2nd, when many prison guards went to a nearby river to rest. The opportunity was unique and time was short, so they got down to work. Previously, the rebels had managed to steal and duplicate the key to the weapons room, so they went there and took all the weapons they found. They had 25 rifles, several pistols and 20 grenades. Everything they needed to subdue the remaining guards and escape from Treblinka. There was no turning back, and their fate was cast. Don't leave your screen. In this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you everything about the Treblinka Rebellion. Are you ready? Let's get started. The Treblinka concentration camp was located northeast of the city of Warsaw, in the middle of a forest. It opened its doors on July 23, 1942, and its inauguration marked a key moment in Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to annihilate the Jews of Poland. The victims of this place number in the hundreds of thousands, and it was one of the most prolific fields when it came to murdering people. In fact, the only place that surpassed it in this task was Auschwitz. Treblinka was made up of 2 separate units, in the first of which prisoners had to do forced labor, such as collecting firewood to fuel the crematoria. In the second unit, mass executions were carried out in the gas chambers. At the beginning of 1943, Treblinka stopped receiving inmates when the deportations to this camp stopped. In March, the Germans activated the secret Plan Action 1005, which was to destroy all evidence of the mass murders. The Germans' reason for covering their tracks was that, around this time, the graves of the Katyn massacre, in which the Soviets shot 10,000 Polish officers, had been discovered. The event caused a huge uproar in the international community, and the Nazi leaders, concerned that their own crimes would come to light, ordered the exhumation of the bodies buried in the extermination centers to incinerate them. The Treblinka prisoners understood that when the Action 1005 plan came to an end, the camp would be dismantled and they would be sent to the gas chambers, to eliminate all witnesses to what was happening inside. Seeing that they were doomed and had nothing to lose, they began to plan one last desperate attempt to escape the horror. The organization of the Treblinka uprising was headed by Julian Korzecki, a former captain in the Polish army who was considered by all to be an honorable man. The leader of the conspiracy collected money and valuables from the Jews in the camp in order to bribe one of the prison guards. Korzecki was convinced that the guard sympathized with them, and would be willing to turn a blind eye to the rebellion in exchange for the money. This proved to be a mistake that jeopardized the uprising, as the guard reported to his superiors that the inmates were up to something. Treblinka officers immediately went looking for Korzecki, but the former captain, to avoid being questioned and betray his friends, committed suicide by swallowing poison. Despite the hard blow, the rest of the conspirators decided to continue with the rebellion. The Nazis had never found out what they were up to. From now on, the revolt was led by another Polish ex-military officer, Dr. Barek Lajczer, who set the date of the uprising for June 15, 1943. They had managed to duplicate the key to the weapons room, with which they had an important advantage. However, when the key moment was approaching, an unexpected event altered the plans. A different group of inmates, unrelated to them, managed to smuggle a grenade into the facility and set it off. From then on, the SS, who were in charge of Treblinka, redoubled security measures. The conspirators postponed the uprising, but not by long, as the amount of work they received was dwindling. This meant that camp activities would soon cease, and they would be sent to the gas chambers. The opportunity came on a hot Monday, August 2, 1943, when many guards abandoned their duties and went to a nearby river to cool off. The rebels set out, stole rifles, grenades and pistols, and around 4 in the afternoon, the uprising began. They sprayed the buildings in the camp with kerosene and blew up the gas tank. The explosion caused a huge fire, and within minutes the flames engulfed the establishment. Hundreds of prisoners understood that this was the signal to escape. They exchanged fire with the guards and killed some, but the Nazis were better equipped, and with their machine guns they massacred hundreds of rebels. The leader of the uprising, Barek Lajczer, was killed in the confrontation. Meanwhile, amid the chaos and confusion, some mutineers tried to escape by jumping over the fence, but got caught in the barbed wire. Another 200 inmates had better luck getting out the front door, but were immediately chased by cars and horses. The great mistake of the conspirators had been not to cut Treblinka's telephone lines, so the SS had no problem getting reinforcements that arrived promptly, blocking the roads and establishing a surveillance perimeter. One of the survivors recalled the hunt as follows: "A car is chasing us with a machine gun shooting in all directions. Many drop dead and I run into corpses with every step I take. I change direction and run to the left of the road. The car is soon in front of me, and though we run in different directions, the assassins surround us." It is estimated that some 70 people managed to escape successfully, hiding in the undergrowth, submerged in the waters of a nearby lake, or running non-stop for hours. However, most died or were subsequently recaptured and executed. After the uprising, the Nazi hierarchs decided to advance the closure of Treblinka. The place had been destroyed, and the cost of rebuilding it would have been too high. The Auschwitz camp was able to house and exterminate prisoners, so Treblinka was no longer necessary. Finally, on October 19, 1943, it closed its doors forever. The survivors of the rebellion rebuilt their lives, although they never forgot the trauma of what happened in the camp. Some of them published their memoirs and helped publicize the horror of the death camps. Years later, when the Treblinka commanders stood trial, former rebels gave their testimony and helped convict those responsible. What other concentration camp escape attempts do you know? 4 months in the bunker, confined to the dark, eating once every 4 days. Time passes as if by stealth, and I hardly count the days anymore. What a scare every time the food arrives and wakes me up. I am in a trance. With these words, a Holocaust survivor recalled the experience of being a prisoner in the Dachau concentration camp. This site was one of the most important detention centers of the Third Reich, and inside it housed tens of thousands of prisoners who were subjected to the most terrible harassment. Dachau was inaugurated in 1933 and functioned until 1945, the year in which it was liberated. The particularity of this camp lies in the fact that, from its beginnings, it was controlled by the SS, and this Nazi organization designed a chilling way to keep the prisoners at bay. They drafted a penal and disciplinary code, which contained all the punishments to which those who failed to comply with the rules of the camp could be subjected. The inmates lived with the threat of death hanging over their heads. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you everything about the punishment suffered by the prisoners at Dachau. To know this story, we must first understand how the concentration camps of the Nazi regime worked. Initially, the first centers did not have unified regulations, and each one administered the sanctions at its discretion. Punishments consisted of a hard bed, denial of food, and solitary confinement in a dark cell, but physical punishment was rare. This changed forever in May 1933, when the SS, who were in charge of the Dachau camp, drew up the legal code detailing what was to be done when a prisoner broke the rules of the establishment. Theodor Eicke, a Nazi officer in charge of directing Dachau, was largely responsible for designing the Dachau Penal and Disciplinary Code. Those who knew him claimed that Eicke was a blind fan of National Socialism, a man willing to make the camp a place of suffering for prisoners in order to re-educate them. The idea that guided the director of the establishment was that, with an adequate dose of mistreatment and sanctions, the inmates would abandon their opposition to Nazism and become worshippers of Hitler. In the event that they refused to abandon their ideals and strictly obey the regulations of the camp, these people could be executed. The lightest punishment at Dachau was confinement in a cell. The regulations of the field described the situations for which a person could suffer this penalty. The inmates had to get up from their bunks every morning, as soon as the guards woke them up, and immediately tidy up the barracks where they slept. No one could wear civilian clothes, only the prisoner uniform could be worn, and they were not even allowed to wear underwear. Lying during an interrogation was prohibited, as was filing false reports, or writing more than 2 letters per month. Whoever broke any of these rules would be confined in the dark for a few days. The dreaded dungeons at Dachau were individual cells with a surface area of 80 centimeters per side. In this tiny space, the inmates could spend between 3 and 42 days, in a narrow hole inside which they had no ability to move. They had to stand, and sitting down was next to impossible. Inside, oxygen was scarce, and as the testimony at the beginning of this video indicates, the food ration was delivered once every 4 days. The inmates nicknamed these cells bunker, in which many died due to the appalling conditions of confinement. The punishments became harsher as the crimes became, according to the Nazis, more serious. For example, those who approached a doctor for treatment without sufficient reason or who pretended to be ill to avoid their daily tasks were punished with time in cells, in addition to several weeks of forced labor. When the authority of the guards was put into play, the most direct violence came into action. Teasing or insolent comments towards a member of the SS were punishable by 50 lashes on the back. The Nazis had no tolerance for actions that put the order of the concentration camp at risk. Any hint of conspiracy, rebellion, or agitation was punishable by death. Acts considered destabilizing included making inflammatory speeches in front of other inmates, smuggling outside items, and concealing items of clothing and objects that could be used as weapons, such as rocks for knives. Most unforgivable of all, however, was trying to escape from Dachau. These actions were punished with a public hanging, so that the other inmates could see what fate awaited them if they wanted to escape from the concentration camp. Assaulting an SS officer, refusing to follow the orders of the guards, or failing to perform forced labor duties had an equally grim result. The rebel was to be executed on the spot with a shot, and then his corpse was hung in public. The same was true when someone caused a fire or explosion, damaged telephone wiring lines, or broke water pipes. All this was considered sabotage and was punishable by death. In the event that the destruction of property occurred due to negligence and not intentionally, the person responsible was sent to individual confinement in the bunker. Theodor Eicke, the director of Dachau, wanted to keep the honor of the Nazi movement clean, and therefore it was strictly forbidden to bribe SS guards with gifts or money, discuss politics, claim communism, criticize the Third Reich or speak ill of Hitler. These insults were punished with permanent confinement in individual cells, until the inmate died there from exhaustion or starvation. By no means were these people released before their time. Finally, the Dachau Penal and Disciplinary Code described a series of complementary punishments in order to maximize the suffering of prisoners. Mandatory exercise sessions were suggested, such as making them run until they fainted, forbidding them to write or receive letters, forcing them to sleep on hard beds, or tying their wrists behind their backs and hanging them by their hands from a pole, dislocating their shoulders. Eicke's career took off from his Dachau administration, eventually commanding an SS division on the Eastern Front when Germany invaded Russia in 1941. There, Eicke was noted for the brutality of his methods and for committing numerous crimes of war, such as the indiscriminate killing of prisoners. In 1943, while on a reconnaissance flight, his plane was hit by Soviet artillery. The ship crashed to the ground and Eicke died instantly. As for the Dachau camp, it continued to function until April 29, 1945, when the United States Army liberated it. The American soldiers were horrified by what they found inside. The corpses of inmates murdered in cold blood by the Nazis were piled up in the establishment. The U.S. troops reacted by killing the surrendering SS prison guards. After the liberation, the establishment continued to function as a residence for war refugees. Later, its facilities were converted into a commemorative museum, where the horror of what happened inside is remembered. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what do you think was the most brutal punishment in this concentration camp? Leave us your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.